How you doing, everybody? My name is Dr. Sammy Baya. Please welcome back to my YouTube channel. Is salt a spiritual weapon? The hidden truth of salt in the Bible. Here is a comprehensive discussion on the topic, is salt a spiritual weapon? The hidden truth of salt in the Bible. Introduction: understanding salt's spiritual significance. Salt has long been a staple in human culture, not just for its culinary value, but also for its symbolic and spiritual significance. The Bible, a central text in many spiritual traditions, often uses salt as a symbol of covenant, purity, and preservation. This essay will delve into the hidden truths about salt in the Bible and explore whether it can be considered a spiritual weapon. Salt in ancient cultures. To fully understand the spiritual significance of salt, it is important to first look at its role in ancient cultures. In ancient times, salt was crucial for preserving food and was often used in religious rituals. Its role as a preservative made it a symbol of enduring quality and faithfulness. Biblical references to salt. Salt is mentioned numerous times in the Bible, both in the Old and New Testaments. These references often carry deeper meanings beyond its physical properties. Exploring these references helps to uncover the layers of spiritual symbolism attributed to salt. The covenant of salt. One of the most significant references to salt in the Bible is the covenant of salt. In Leviticus chapter 2 verse 13, God commands that all grain offerings be seasoned with salt. This covenant symbolizes the enduring and unbreakable nature of God's promises to his people. Salt as a symbol of purity. Salt is frequently used as a symbol of purity and sanctity in the Bible. For instance, in Matthew chapter 5 verse 13, Jesus refers to his followers as the salt of the earth, indicating that they are to bring purity and goodness to the world. The preservation role of salt. Salt's role as a preservative also carries spiritual significance. Just as salt preserves food from decay, it symbolizes the preservation of moral and spiritual integrity in the face of corruption and decay. Salt in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, salt appears in various contexts, including sacrifices and rituals. The use of salt in these ceremonies highlights its role in maintaining the purity and sanctity of worship practices. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The story of Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt in Genesis chapter 19 verse 26 is often interpreted as a warning against looking back or clinging to a sinful past. The transformation into salt represents the permanence of judgment and the consequences of disobedience. Salt and hospitality. In biblical times, salt was also a symbol of hospitality. Sharing salt with guests was a sign of friendship and commitment. This tradition underscores the importance of relationships and the role of salt in fostering communal bonds. Salt in the New Testament. In the New Testament, Jesus reference to his followers as the salt of the earth. That is Matthew chapter 5 verse 13. It reinforces the idea that they are to influence and preserve the world with their faith and moral conduct. The power of salt in spiritual warfare. Some modern interpretations suggest that salt can be used as a spiritual weapon in rituals and prayers. This perspective draws on the idea that salt's purifying properties can help ward off negative energies or evil forces. Symbolism of salt in rituals. Various spiritual and religious traditions use salt in rituals for purification and protection. For instance, in some Christian practices, salt is used in baptismal ceremonies to symbolize cleansing and spiritual renewal. Historical uses of salt in spiritual practices. Throughout history, salt has been used in spiritual practices across cultures. In ancient Judaism, salt was used in sacrifices and offerings, while in other traditions it was employed to ward off evil spirits and protect sacred spaces. The role of salt in maintaining spiritual integrity. Salt's role as a preservative can be seen as a metaphor for maintaining spiritual integrity. Just as salt preserves food, individuals are encouraged to preserve their faith and moral values amid challenges and temptations. The spiritual significance of salt in different cultures. Salt's spiritual significance is not limited to Christianity. Many cultures and religions incorporate salt into their spiritual practices, recognizing its power to cleanse, protect, and sanctify. Salt as a metaphor for faithfulness. In biblical times, the use of salt in covenants and offerings symbolizes faithfulness and commitment. The enduring nature of salt reflects the steadfastness of divine promises and the loyalty expected of believers. The chemistry of salt and spirituality. The physical properties of salt, its ability to dissolve, and its preservative qualities can be seen as metaphors for spiritual concepts. The idea that salt dissolves and integrates into its surroundings parallels the believer's role in integrating faith into daily life. Salt and spiritual cleansing. In some spiritual traditions, salt is used for cleansing rituals. The idea is that salt can absorb and remove negative energies or impurities, paralleling its physical role in purifying food. The use of salt in spiritual warfare. In contemporary spiritual practices, salt is sometimes used in rituals designed to protect against negative forces or entities. This usage is based on the belief that salt's purity and preservation properties can create a barrier against spiritual threats. Salt and the concept of purity. Purity is a recurring theme in biblical texts, and salt is often associated with this concept. The idea that salt symbolizes purity extends beyond physical cleanliness to encompass moral and spiritual purity. The role of salt in Christian rituals. In Christianity, salt is used in various rituals, including blessings and exorcisms. These practices highlight salt's perceived power to purify and protect, reinforcing its role as a spiritual tool. Salt and the idea of covenant. The covenant of salt in the Bible represents a binding agreement that is meant to endure. This concept underscores the idea that divine promises are unchanging and eternal. The evolution of salt's symbolism. Over time, the symbolism of salt has evolved, but its core meanings, that is purity, preservation, and protection, remain consistent. Understanding this evolution can provide insight into how salt functions as a spiritual weapon. Salt in the context of modern spirituality. In modern spiritual practices, salt is often used in rituals to create sacred spaces and to ward off negative influences. This contemporary usage reflects ancient beliefs about salt's power to protect and sanctify. The theological implications of salt. The theological implications of salt's use in the Bible include its role as a symbol of God's promises and the believer's responsibilities. These implications offer a deeper understanding of how salt functions in spiritual contexts. The symbolic power of salt in religious art. Salt's symbolism extends into religious art, where it is often depicted to convey purity, sanctity, and protection. This artistic representation reinforces, it reinforces the idea of salt as a spiritual symbol. Salt and its connection to divine presence. In some spiritual interpretations, salt is seen as a representation of divine presence. Its ability to preserve and purify is viewed as reflecting the enduring and transformative nature of divine influence. The role of salt in spiritual healing. Salt is sometimes used in spiritual healing practices where it is believed to cleanse and restore balance. This usage highlights the belief in salt's power to affect spiritual and emotional well-being. Salt and the concept of protection. In many spiritual traditions, salt is used to create protective barriers. The belief is that salt can repel negative energies and safeguard sacred spaces, reflecting its role as a spiritual shield. The use of salt in purification rituals. Purification rituals often incorporate salt to cleanse individuals or spaces from negative influences. The use of salt in these rituals underscores its role in maintaining spiritual cleanliness and integrity. Salt as a symbol of spiritual authority. In some interpretations, the use of salt in rituals signifies spiritual authority. The idea is that salt's properties confer a sense of control and power over spiritual forces. The biblical symbolism of salt and light. Jesus' analogy of being the salt of the earth and light of the world, that is Matthew chapter 5, 13 to 14, verse 13-14, connects salt's purifying and preserving qualities with the moral and spiritual guidance that believers are called to provide. Salt and concept of spiritual warfare. Salt and concepts of spiritual warfare. In spiritual warfare, salt is sometimes used as a tool to combat negative forces. This practice is based on the belief that salt's purity and protective qualities can influence spiritual battles. The historical context of salt in religious texts. Understanding the historical context of salt's use in religious texts provides insight into its spiritual significance. Salt's role in ancient rituals and practices highlights its importance in maintaining religious and moral order. Salt and the idea of transformation. Salt's ability to transform food through preservation and flavoring can be seen as a metaphor for spiritual transformation. This idea suggests that salt symbolizes the process of change and renewal in spiritual life. The spiritual dimension of salt's preservation. Salt's preservation role is often viewed as symbolic of spiritual endurance. The idea is that just as salt prevents food from decaying, spiritual practices can help maintain faith and moral integrity. Salt and its role in sacred spaces. In some traditions, salt is used to sanctify sacred spaces. The practice reflects the belief that soul's purity can help create and maintain environments conducive to spiritual activities and divine presence. The influence of salt on spiritual practices. Salt's influence on spiritual practices is evident in its use in rituals and ceremonies across different cultures. This influence underscores salt's role as a symbol of purity, protection, and divine connection. Salt and the concept of spiritual purity. Spiritual purity is a central theme in many religious traditions, and salt is often associated with this concept. The idea is that salt's purifying properties can symbolize the process of achieving and maintaining spiritual cleanliness. The role of salt in Jewish rituals. In Jewish rituals, salt is used in various contexts, including sacrifices and blessings. These practices highlight salt's role in maintaining the sanctity and purity of religious observances. Salt and its symbolism in Christianity. In Christianity, salt is used to symbolize the transformative power of faith. The reference to believers as the salt of the earth emphasizes their role in influencing the world positively. The use of salt in modern spirituality. Modern spiritual practices often incorporate salt for its perceived protective and purifying qualities. This contemporary usage reflects ongoing beliefs about salt's power to influence spiritual and emotional states. The connection between salt and divine promises. Salt's association with divine promises in the Bible underscores its significance as a symbol of faithfulness and commitment. This connection highlights the enduring nature of spiritual agreements. Salt as a metaphor for moral integrity. In biblical teachings, salt's role as a preservative serves as a metaphor for moral integrity. The idea is that just as salt preserves food, individuals are called to preserve moral and ethical standards. The role of salt in exorcisms. In some spiritual practices, salt is used in exorcisms to drive away evil spirits. This usage is based on the belief that salt's purifying and protective qualities can combat negative forces. Salt and the concept of spiritual influence. The concept of spiritual influence is linked to salt's ability to affect its surroundings. Believers are encouraged to influence the world positively, similar to how salt enhances and preserves food. The symbolic power of salt in prayer. Salt is sometimes used in prayer practices to invoke protection and purification. The symbolic power of salt in this context reflects its perceived ability to affect spiritual outcomes. Salt and its role in ritual cleansing. Ritual cleansing practices often involve salt to remove impurities and restore balance. This use highlights salt's role in maintaining spiritual and emotional well-being. The spiritual dimension of salt's preservation. Salt's preservation of food can be seen as a metaphor for spiritual endurance. The idea is that just as salt preserves food from decay, spiritual practices can help preserve faith and moral integrity. Salt and the idea of sacred space. Creating sacred spaces often involves the use of salt to sanctify and protect the area. This practice reflects the belief in salt's power to create environments conducive to spiritual activities. The use of salt in healing rituals. In some spiritual traditions, salt is used in healing rituals to promote physical and emotional well-being. The belief is that salt's purifying qualities can aid in the healing process. Salt and the concept of spiritual cleansing. Spiritual cleansing practices often incorporate salt to remove negative influences and restore balance. This use of salt underscores its role in maintaining spiritual purity. The role of salt in protecting against negative energies. Using salt to protect against negative energies reflects its perceived power to create barriers and safeguard individuals or spaces. This practice highlights the protective qualities attributed to salt. Salt as a symbol of divine presence. The belief that salt represents divine presence is rooted in its ability to preserve and purify. This symbolism reflects the idea of divine influence as enduring and transformative. The connection between salt and spiritual authority. Salt's use in rituals can signify spiritual authority and control over negative forces. This connection underscores the belief in salt's power to influence spiritual outcomes. The historical evolution of salt's spiritual significance. The spiritual significance of salt has evolved over time, from ancient rituals to modern practices. Understanding this evolution provides insight into salt's ongoing role in spiritual contexts. The influence of salt on sacred rituals. Salt's influence on sacred rituals is evident in its use across various spiritual traditions. This influence reflects salt's perceived power to purify, protect, and sanctify. Salt and the concept of moral integrity. Moral integrity is often symbolized by salt's preservative qualities. The idea is that just as salt preserves food, individuals are called to uphold moral and ethical standards. The role of salt in spiritual warfare practices. In spiritual warfare practices, salt is sometimes used as a tool to combat negative forces. This usage reflects the belief in salt's power to influence spiritual battles. Salt and the idea of spiritual influence. Spiritual influence is linked to salt's ability to affect its surroundings. Believers are encouraged to positively influence the world, similar to how salt enhances and preserves food. The symbolic power of salt in modern spirituality. Salt's symbolic power in modern spirituality reflects its role in purification, protection, and sanctification. Contemporary practices continue to draw on these ancient beliefs. Salt and its role in creating sacred spaces. Creating sacred spaces often involves the use of salt to sanctify and protect the area. This practice reflects the belief in salt's power to create environments conducive to spiritual activities. The use of salt in ritual cleansing practices. Ritual cleansing practices often incorporate salt to remove impurities and restore balance. This use underscores salt's role in maintaining spiritual and emotional well-being. The role of salt in purification rituals. Purification rituals that use salt reflect its perceived ability to cleanse and renew. This practice highlights salt's role in maintaining spiritual purity and integrity. The concept of spiritual protection through salt. The concept of spiritual protection through salt involves using its properties to ward off negative influences. This practice underscores salt's role as a spiritual shield. The influence of salt on ritual practices. Salt's influence on ritual practices reflects its perceived power to protect, to purify, protect, and sanctify. This influence underscores the enduring significance of salt in spiritual contexts. Salt and the idea of spiritual renewal. Salt's use in spiritual renewal practices reflects its role in cleansing and restoring balance. This practice highlights salt's ability to facilitate spiritual growth and transformation. The symbolism of salt in ancient rituals. Salt's symbolism in ancient rituals reflects its role in maintaining purity and sanctity. This historical context provides insight into salt's enduring spiritual significance. The role of salt in maintaining sacred traditions. Maintaining sacred traditions often involves the use of salt in rituals and ceremonies. This practice reflects the belief in salt's power to preserve and protect spiritual practices. The spiritual dimension of salt's preservation. The spiritual dimension of salt's preservation role reflects its ability to maintain moral and spiritual integrity. This symbolism underscores the importance of faithfulness and endurance. Salt and the concept of sacred protection. Using salt for sacred protection involves its use to create barriers against negative forces. This practice highlights salt's role as a protective and purifying agent. The influence of salt on spiritual cleansing. Salt's influence on spiritual cleansing reflects its ability to remove impurities and restore balance. This practice underscores salt's role in maintaining spiritual purity. The role of salt in spiritual healing practices. Salt's role in spiritual healing practices reflects its perceived ability to promote physical and emotional well-being. This use highlights salt's power to aid in the healing process. The symbolic power of salt in sacred spaces. Salt's symbolic power in sacred spaces reflects its ability to sanctify and protect. This practice underscores the belief in salt's role in creating environments conducive to spiritual activities. Salt and the concept of spiritual endurance. Spiritual endurance is symbolized by salt's preservative qualities. The idea is that just as salt preserves food, spiritual practices can help maintain faith and moral integrity. The role of salt in modern spiritual practices. Modern spiritual practices often incorporate salt for its perceived protective and purifying qualities. This contemporary usage reflects ongoing beliefs about salt's power to influence spiritual and emotional states. Salt and the idea of spiritual purity. Spiritual purity is often symbolized by salt's purifying properties. The idea is that salt's ability to cleanse can be seen as a metaphor for achieving and maintaining spiritual cleanliness. The historical evolution of salt's role in spirituality. The historical evolution of salt's role in spirituality reflects changes in its symbolic significance. Understanding this evolution provides insight into salt's ongoing role in spiritual contexts. Salt and the concept of moral preservation. Salt's influence on ritual cleansing reflects its perceived ability to remove impurities and restore balance. This practice highlights salt's role in maintaining spiritual and emotional well-being. Salt and the idea of spiritual protection. Spiritual protection through salt involves using its properties to ward off negative influences. This practice underscores salt's role as a protective and purifying agent. The symbolism of salt in religious practices. Salt's symbolism in religious practices reflects its role in maintaining purity and sanctity. This symbolism underscores the enduring significance of salt in spiritual contexts. The role of salt in spiritual purification. Salt's role in spiritual purification reflects its ability to cleanse and renew. This practice highlights salt's power to facilitate spiritual growth and transformation. Salt and the concept of sacred renewal. Using salt for sacred renewal reflects its role in restoring balance and purity. This practice underscores salt's significance in spiritual practices and rituals. The historical context of salt in spiritual practices. The historical context of salt in spiritual practices provides insight into its symbolic significance. Understanding this context helps to uncover the layers of meaning associated with salt. Salt and the idea of spiritual influence. Spiritual influence is linked to salt's ability to affect its surroundings. Believers are encouraged to positively influence the world, similar to how salt enhances and preserves food. The role of salt in creating sacred traditions. Creating sacred traditions often involves the use of salt in rituals and ceremonies. This practice reflects the belief in salt's power to preserve and protect spiritual practices. Salt and the concept of spiritual integrity. Spiritual integrity is symbolized by salt's preservative qualities. The idea is that just as salt preserves food, Individuals are called to uphold moral and ethical standards. The influence of salt on sacred spaces. Salt's influence on sacred spaces reflects its ability to sanctify and protect. This practice underscores the belief in salt's role in creating environments conducive to spiritual activities. The role of salt in modern rituals. Modern rituals often incorporate salt for its perceived protective and purifying qualities. This contemporary usage reflects ongoing beliefs about salt's power to influence spiritual and emotional states. The symbolic power of salt in spiritual renewal. Salt's symbolic power in spiritual renewal reflects its role in cleansing and restoring balance. This practice highlights salt's ability to facilitate spiritual growth and transformation. Salt and the idea of sacred protection. Using salt for sacred protection involves its use to create barriers against negative forces. This practice underscores salt's role as a spiritual shield. The influence of salt on ritual practices. Salt's influence on ritual practices reflects its perceived power to purify, protect, and sanctify. This influence underscores the enduring significance of salt in spiritual contexts, the role of salt in spiritual endurance. Spiritual endurance is symbolized by salt's preservative qualities. The idea is that just as salt preserves food, spiritual practices can help maintain faith and moral integrity. The historical evolution of salt's spiritual significance. The historical evolution of salt's spiritual significance reflects changes in its symbolic role. Understanding this evolution provides insight into salt's ongoing importance in spiritual practices. Salt and the concept of moral integrity. Moral integrity is often symbolized by salt's preservative qualities. The idea is that just as salt preserves food, individuals are called to uphold moral and ethical standards. The role of salt in modern spiritual practices. Modern spiritual practices often incorporate salt for its perceived protective and purifying qualities. This contemporary usage reflects ongoing beliefs about salt's power to influence spiritual and emotional states. Salt and the idea of spiritual cleansing. Spiritual cleansing practices often incorporate salt to remove impurities and restore balance. This use underscores salt's role in maintaining spiritual purity. The symbolism of salt in sacred rituals. Salt's symbolism in sacred rituals reflects its role in maintaining purity and sanctity. This symbolism underscores the enduring significance of salt in spiritual contexts. In conclusion, the hidden truth of salt as a spiritual weapon. In conclusion, salt holds a multifaceted role in spiritual and religious contexts. Its symbolism of purity, preservation, and protection reflects deeper spiritual truths. While it may not be a weapon in a conventional sense, salt's use in rituals and practices highlights its significance as a tool for maintaining spiritual integrity and combating negative forces. Now, this video, this content that I've given you should provide a comprehensive exploration of salt's spiritual significance and its role as a potential spiritual weapon in various contexts. Thank you for watching this video. If you've watched this video from start to end, thank you so much. May God bless you always. Remember, knowledge is power, information is power, and learning is the superpower. If you've not subscribed to my YouTube channel, please just appreciate this video by subscribing. Please click that subscribe button and share this video widely as possible. Thank you. God bless you. Catch you later in the next video. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel.